1 Samuel 17:40. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine.
This is a question that's been posed to me a few times. I first heard the question when I was in college. And at the time when I first heard it, it was one of those things where I thought, I don't know, is it really that big of a deal to think about? But the more and more that I've thought about this question, the more and more I think that there is a spiritual application. And we're going to look at 2 possible answers to this question that I think both of them have spiritual value to them. So whichever way we're going to take it, I think we'll learn a lesson here. But what did we just read? What did Lyndon just read? David goes to a brook and picks 5 smooth stones. Which, by the way, I grew up being taught it was 5 little stones. We'll talk about that in a minute. 5, that's part of the song. If you don't know, there's a song to the tune of Davy Crockett about Daniel. And young boy David down by the brook, 5 little stones from it he took. That's what I grew up singing, okay? But it's not actually not what he says. It says he took 5 smooth stones. So the question is, why did David take 5? You ever thought about that? He had one person to face, right? Goliath. Why take 5? Before we try to delve into that question, though, we're going to start with what is the problem that's actually going on here. So if you'll turn to 1 Samuel 17, 1 Samuel 17, we're going to get a little bit of history of what's going on here. Okay? So what is Israel's problem right at this moment? Well, one word, it's the Philistines, and we see that they are at war with them, starting in verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Soko and Azekah in the Aphiz Damim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. So they're facing each other, ready to go to battle. And this is not the first time that they have encountered the Philistines before, that they had fought them. And in fact, if you recall, if you go forward in time to David being left in the city with his sin with Bathsheba, what it says there is, in the springtime when kings usually went out to battle, David stayed in Jerusalem. Well, that's more than likely about this time. That this was the time that the Philistines or any of the other enemies of Israel that could actually put up any of a fight would come out and take their stand against them. But the Philistines have always been a thorn in the Israelites' side ever since the conquest of Canaan. They could never quite rid them of the thorn in their side. But it begs the question, if this is not the first time that they fought against the Philistines, why aren't they winning? And some historians have actually said that by the time Goliath comes here in verse 4, that there actually has already been some fighting. The Bible doesn't tell us that. So I'm not sure where they're getting their information, but that would still lend itself to the same question here. Why hasn't Israel won? And to me, I think the easiest answer for us is it's the same reason that no one can defeat Goliath. Let's keep reading. Verse 4. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath. By the way, you'll see later the Gittite, and that means from Gath. whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, with the head of his spear weighing 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you, servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us." Again, the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel to this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Now look at verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So what's the problem? They have no idea who sits and rules above them. And in fact, David is going to specifically point out the problem over in verse 26. He's going to ask this question if we kept reading. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Did you forget who you serve? You serve the living God. By the way, that same God that took the Israelites just a couple of centuries earlier and completely wiped out Canaan, just decimated the Canaanites. Yeah, there were pockets left, and now we see the problem leaving pockets left, but they took over the vast majority of Canaan, all with the help of God. In fact, the first couple of battles had nothing to do with their fighting prowess at all. It had everything to do with God saying, "Do this meaningless thing and I will give you the fight," like Jericho. Or they didn't even have to find a way to cross the Jordan. They didn't have to build a bridge. God said, "Just walk down to the edge of the water. I'll make sure you can get across." That God, that's the God that they serve. And so David is listening to all of this. And look at verse 31. So he's asked this question, right? Taunting the armies of the living God. When the words which David spoke, verse 31, were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. And I've always thought, why? Why send for David? And I think part of it is because he knows the morale of the entire camp. And here is one man talking about how we can win, we're the armies of the living God. Okay, I've got to see what kind of optimism this young man has. So David says to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail on account of him." On account of, by the way, a 9 foot, 9 inch tall man. Okay. Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. Fine, if that's the problem, just let me go. And at first it feels a little bit like bravado, right? And that's exactly the way his brothers take it. Is that it's just bravado. Okay, you don't know what you're talking about. There's no way we can defeat this giant. Well, Saul has the same idea. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, "Your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." So I love this moment here. He'll be like one of them. I've faced scarier. And I gotta say, even a 9-foot tall human, I think I'd rather go against that than a lion or a bear, personally. But notice, again, at first it seems to me a little bit like bravado, but what's the point here? Okay, he wants to fight someone from the armies of the living God, let's go. Because this is God we're talking about here. So Saul, again, thinking with his carnal brain, Saul clothed David with his garments, put a bronze helmet on his head, clothed him with his armor. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." And David took them off. And then we hit verse 40. He took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So it doesn't tell us, but it seems a little bit like he leaves Saul's presence and perhaps in full view of Goliath just goes to the river, picks a few stones, puts them in his bag, and then walks toward Goliath. And I love Goliath's response. Because, and the reason I love it so much is because it's so poetic about what's going to happen next. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. So he doesn't even feel the need to take everything from his shield bearer. We're just going to walk up here because what's this little kid going to do to me? We don't know how old he is, but it's believed that he might have been somewhere around 17 years old. But that's kind of up for debate. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you should come at me with sticks?" Well, that's all he's really going to need. And in fact, not even sticks, a stone. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. He was already making mistakes. That was the last one. The Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the armies of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky, to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." It happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand into his bag, took from it a stone and slung it, struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him, and there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And the Philistines saw their champion was dead. They fled, and they're pursued. I wanted to show this to you. When we talk about David's stones, like I said earlier, I was always told that they were these small stones. Well, the British Museum, they were setting up a part of their museum that specializes in biblical artifacts. And they actually went to the Valley of Elah, and they started looking in the brooks around there for stones that could possibly be the stones that David chose. And they actually took a pile of what are kind of smaller than average stones that you're going to find in Elah. And so I got to take a picture of them. One of the few times you can take a picture in the British Museum. If the letters right there don't really give you a good idea here, here's a lacrosse ball. It's about the size of those stones. And this is what David does. He takes 5 of these. And as you can see there, the brook there actually does a pretty good job of smoothing them out, making them fairly round, which actually is pretty good for aerodynamics. But these are the stones that David takes. But still it begs the question, why 5? And again, I said there are 2 answers to this question. And I think there's something we can take from both possible answers. The first one I call the poetic or the flowery answer. It's the one that I would like to be true, but we're not really sure. The poetic version really comes from, keep your finger here, and if you'll turn with me over to 2 Samuel chapter 21. 2 Samuel 21, hold on, we're in 1 Samuel 17. Well, it'll help us out here a little bit when we go to 2 Samuel chapter 21. So this is after David has already become king. If you start with me in verse 15. Now the Philistines were at war again with Israel. David went down and his servants with him, and they fought against the Philistines, and David became weary. Then Ishbi-Benob, who was among the descendants of the giant, the weight of whose spear was 300 shekels of bronze in weight, was girded with a new sword. He intended to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, helped him and struck the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David swore to him, saying, "You shall not go out again with us to battle, so that you do not extinguish the lamp of Israel." Now it came about after this that there was war again with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Saph, who was among the descendants of the giant. There was war with the Philistines again at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, not the same Goliath. In fact, 1 Chronicles tells us that it's actually Lami, who is the brother of Goliath. We'll get to that in a moment. The shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Hey, just like we said about Goliath. There was war at Gath again, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. He had also been born to the giant. When he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. So if I take, 1 Chronicles doesn't say that they're all brothers here, but verse 22 here in 2 Samuel 21 says that they are. And if I take that instead of Goliath in verse 19, over in 1 Chronicles 20, it says Lami, Goliath the Gittite's brother, then that is 4 brothers. Ishbi-Benob. Saph is the name in 2 Samuel 21's account. 1 Chronicles 20 calls him Sippai. And then Lami, again, that comes from 1 Chronicles 20 instead of Goliath himself, because we know David killed him. And then this unnamed giant with 24 digits. If you notice, that's 5. Goliath and his 4 brothers. So think about that. David takes 5 stones because it's going to take 5 stones to kill 5 men. And the reason I like that answer so much is once again, it declares the faith that David has. That David not only has in this moment where he's going to kill Goliath, but really the faith that he has his entire life. 5 stones for 5 men. Because David knew that God was going to be victorious. Yes, through him, but God was going to be the one who is victorious. And if I can kill this man, then I can kill his brothers. Now, we have no idea if David knew that he had brothers. We don't know what he knows at the time of 1 Samuel chapter 17. So I was going to call this the more realistic, but I was going to be nicer to it. I call it the less poetic, but to me personally, I think this is probably the closer idea, but I think the other one is just as possible. In fact, if we go back to verses 34 through 37, I think we'll come to sort of the less poetic answer here. David said to Saul, "Your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he's taunted the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go." So I want you to notice what the first thing that David tells Saul here is that, one, he attacks the animal taking one of his sheep. Then when it rises up to kill him, then he strikes back. So if you think about it, that's two stones, right? Well, perhaps he's just trying to be prepared. Maybe it'll take 5 stones to take down this Goliath. But I want you to note here, that's no less faithful. That's no less full of faith. And let me tell you why. First off, if you notice here, what is this that David says to Saul in verse 34? He starts talking about his skill. Well, let me tell you, I've killed a lion and a bear. What difference is a man? And he talks about how what he has done to protect his father's flock, but then what does he say in verse 37? It's David's skill, but it's the Lord's work. It's the Lord's doing. And the more I thought about this answer, I thought, well, what are we supposed to take from this? Let's say David thought it'll take no more than 5 to kill Goliath. David knew that ultimately the victory would go to God, but he expected that he would have to work. You know what? God is going to be the victor this day, but if it takes me 5 stones, it'll take me 5 stones. I know that God is the one who's going to win today, and he's right about that. But guess who had to loose the stone from his sling? David. David had to loose the stone from the sling. Maybe God controlled its flight path. Maybe God gave it extra power. Or how about God gave David the skill to even do it in the first place? It's still God at work, but David had to put forth effort. And if you look at David's life, that's the way that he thinks. He trusts in the Lord, but realizes he has to put forth effort. And it may not come the first time. Perhaps what he learned from fighting the lion and the bear is 1 stone is not enough. This time it was, because God made it so. But with the lion and the bear, maybe it took 2 stones. But instead of wondering whether or not God was going to let him win, he took 5 just to be sure. Because he knew that he had to work. This is the way that God expects us to live our lives. And actually, God expects us to look at both of these options. I should have the faith to say 5 stones for 5 men. I have to have that kind of faith. We talked about this on Wednesday in Bible class with talking about prayer. Do you really believe that God is going to give you a scenario in which you will be victorious? If you don't think that, then what's the point of trying? But God doesn't expect you to just think that it'll all be easy. You have to work. Perhaps it's not the first stone that works. Maybe it's the second. Maybe life will bring you to a point where you throw the first one and realize you weren't prepared. You didn't bring 5 stones with you, and you wish you would have. Either way, we look at why David takes 5 stones. And this was so long why I never really counted this question as a real question. Because at the end of the day, whether or not David took 1 stone or 5, God wins. God makes David victorious. The reason that David is victorious is because he went out. He went out in full assurance of faith that he would be victorious by the Lord's help. I love that. It's something that I didn't notice until I was much older, that David rushes toward the line. He doesn't casually walk, let's get this over with. He runs to him with the courage that only a man of faith can have. Is this the way that we think? Is this the way that you think? If not, we need to change that. As we spoke on Wednesday night, we talked about how Jesus promises us that God would move a mountain if we ask. And we often stop and say, yeah, but he's not really. And I always want to smack people upside the head and say, how dare you put God in your box? Because that's not what he said. Jesus didn't say, he will move a mountain if you ask, but he probably won't. That's not what Jesus said. He said he will if you ask him in faith. But here's the thing. If you don't think God's going to move a mountain, then how about the bigger things than moving a mountain? The things that you are facing every day are actually bigger than God moving a mountain. That's easy. Getting you to change, that's way harder than moving a mountain. Getting you to realize that you need to get up and work for the Lord, way harder than moving a mountain. You ingraining in your very soul 5 stones for 5 men, that's harder than moving a mountain. But if Jesus can do that for you, then what else is he going to do for you? What else can he do for you? So we're going to sing, Are You Washed in the Blood? Jesus made the impossible possible, which is that we could be saved from our sins. And because of who we are, that's impossible. And then God took the impossible and said, yeah, but I feel like I'm going to do it anyway. And he took Jesus, and he did more than move a mountain. It wasn't 5 stones for 5 men. It was 1 man for all humanity. If Jesus didn't have a faith that surpassed that of David, he would not have been our Savior. He would not have been our sacrifice. And we wouldn't be singing about being washed in his blood. We'd either be singing about someone else's blood, or we'd be singing about how we're all lost in our sins. Because nobody has saved us. That wasn't the way Jesus thought. We're supposed to emulate Jesus, right? If you want to write a note for yourself, maybe make this some of your homework this week. I want you to look at what's going on in your life and how can you apply the mentality of 5 stones for 5 men? Or how can you employ that I've got to work? I need to take 5 stones with me to make sure I get the job done. Whatever that means to you through this week, keep that mindset at the forefront of your mind. Because you're going to find it's incredible what you can get done with that kind of mentality. But right now, That mentality means that you are going to come up here to the front and you're going to make everything right with God. That's taking that first stone and slinging it at the enemy. And we can fell it in one stone right now, tonight. The problem is you have to have faith like David. And if you don't think you have faith like David, why are you here? This place is not for you. God can do anything, including taking one stone and killing a man. It's so much more difficult to face the problems of our life than dealing with a man like Goliath. He's just a man. He's flesh and blood. He can be defeated. You can take advantage of the faith that God has offered you, that God has so graciously given to you, and you can make it right with Him. Take that stone, sling your first stone tonight as we stand and as we sing.